We're bringing it back now, the policy perspective, to Washington State, and nobody can do that better than Tony Usabelli. He did this panel at the Energy Conference in January, and I sent him an email the next day and said, will you do that again in May? So here he is, back again. So those of you that were at the Energy Conference, you may have heard this, but it's still new and ever evolving. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Quite exciting to work with your Center of Excellence. I'm just amazed to reflect back on the fact that this is your 11th conference. That's really an achievement. So congratulations on that. I think it's also very timely. As I was looking at some of my emails this morning, and I noticed from the American Wind Energy Association, and they send out a weekly update on key items, and they were talking, not surprisingly, about clean energy. And they mentioned an analysis that just came out. I believe it was from the U.S. Department of Labor. And they said that the single fastest growing occupation over the next, I think this was either a 5-year or a 10-year period, with the highest percentage increase are on clean energy jobs, specifically for the technicians, job that I wouldn't like to have, that do that 300-foot climb up to the top of the towers to do all of the repair and maintenance on those facilities. So I think that's just illustrative of much of what you've already heard this morning about the opportunities that are represented in this area. So this morning, as Barbara said, we want to talk a little bit about the executive action, and I'm very pleased here to have some of my panelists that were at our energy conference that we held back in November of last year. This is an annual energy conference. I'll put it in a quick advertisement. Our next annual energy conference, the State Energy Futures Conference for Washington, will be held on November 1st of this year up at the Sheraton at SeaTac. So if any of you are interested, I'd certainly encourage you to sign up. So as I said, I'm very pleased here to have a couple of really experts in their area. Susan Wickwire, who is the executive director of the 2030 district in Seattle, and brings some pretty exciting background and knowledge from the local level, but also has done a stint back in that other Washington, working on energy and climate issues, is joining us this morning. And then also Ann Rendall, a commissioner with Washington's Utility and Transportation Commission, to talk about some of the actions that the Utilities and Transportation Commission is involved with. And then I was hoping to get our third panelist from the Washington State Department of Ecology, but they actually happen to be in the midst of some work on some executive action related to energy and climate, specifically their clean air rule, and so they weren't available, so I'll talk a little bit about that and pinch hit. We have some prepared remarks here, but I really hope that this is an opportunity as well for some good dialogue with you. So please feel free as we go along to ask questions or bring up perspectives or comments here. So let me just begin with a little bit of background here. So, executive action on climate. So, you remember high school civics? And you were probably in this situation. Oh my God, I'm going to fall asleep. This is civics, This is not science or art or, music or anything exciting. But I think this is important from the perspective of those of you now getting involved or having been involved in the energy, and now the nexus between energy and environment and climate in particular, is to understand kind of who the key players are. And we heard this morning from Senator Cantwell's staff about the fact that they have an energy bill, the first effort at a comprehensive energy bill in Congress now in almost 10 years, and a pretty amazing achievement of bipartisanship between the Republican chair of that committee and Senator Cantwell as the ranking minority member on that committee. And again, we'll hope that something productive and useful will come out of the conference with the House in that regard. So people tend to think about new pieces of legislation, but what we want to focus on here this morning is looking at the other branch of government. So back to your Civics 101, the legislative branch establishes the laws. Those are passed. They go to the executive, be it the president or the governor or the mayor, for implementation and signature. And then, of course, overseeing all of this is the judicial branch, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that, particularly with respect to the Clean Power Plan that the EPA promulgated earlier this year and then has been suspended by the United States Supreme Court. So I think as you kind of understand the roadmap here, we want to focus on what's going on in the executive branch, and really for, I'd say, two major reasons. One is that the executive branch has a significant amount of authority. They're the responsible in the state of Washington for the day-to-day administration of government, a lot of the things that we all depend on every day, at the direction, at the behest of the laws that are created by the legislature and signed by the governor. So the kinds of things that should the energy bill in Congress pass, for example, it will be largely implemented by agencies such as the U.S. Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency and Homeland Security and any number of other agencies that are involved in doing that on a day-to-day basis. And then in addition, and we'll certainly also talk about that, the legislature also delegates significant authority to these agencies over and above just the implementation of the laws, and they create mechanisms such as the agency that Ann has responsibility for as a commissioner, the Utilities and Transportation Commission, which says, we can't deal on a day-to-day basis with all of the complexities and issues associated with regulating some of our investor-owned utilities, as one example. We need to delegate that and present that authority to a state agency. So that's going to be our focus here this morning, to give you a little bit of the landscape of how the executive agencies work, talking both at the national level and also particularly at the state level in that regard. And then again, as I said, very interested in hearing some commentary and questions from you as we go along. So let me just, by way of a little bit more background, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists here, and just give you a little bit of a context around the state of Washington. I put up a couple of graphs there just by way of illustration. A lot of detail on these graphs, but I think they're instructive and illustrative of the kinds of issues that we deal with in the energy space in the state of Washington. The two graphs are the one that looks like the spaghetti diagram, or what's called a Sankey diagram, shows the flows of energy through the Washington state economy, with the sources on one side, the consumption on the other side, and then the amount that is not turned into useful and productive work, the wasted energy in the system. And the other diagram, the graph, illustrates our production of greenhouse gases in the state of Washington. So let me just say a few words about those so you get a little bit of context. So in the state of Washington, the 800-pound gorilla in the energy game really is the transportation sector. At least on my graph, it's the big blue bar up at the top there. And that's the use and the production and consumption of petroleum in the state of Washington. It's our largest energy expenditure by far, even with gasoline and oil prices down. It is by far our largest energy user overall, as certainly you can see by the size of the bar that's up there. And then from an environmental perspective, and you can see that in the bottom part of the other graph, it is by far the largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the state. So as I said, that's really kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the state. That is where I think we are in particular trying to find opportunities and ways to focus both from an energy and from an environmental perspective. What can the state do to help contain costs in that area, reduce our energy use, and in turn reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? And then the other point that I'll make down there, and I think you know this, growing up here or living here and working here in the Pacific Northwest, is down at the bottom, is our electricity sector. With the large contribution of hydroelectricity into the energy system and the electricity system in the United States. By far, Washington State is the largest producer and consumer of hydroelectric generated electricity in the country. And by large measure, that is one of the reasons why we have overall some of the cleanest electricity generation in the United States, and also why we have some of the lowest. In fact, back the latest numbers that I saw in 2014, we had the lowest electricity prices of any of the states in the United States. And again, largely a legacy of our hydro resource and the ability that we've seen here in the Northwest to conserve how we use energy and extend the benefits and the values of that. And overall, just as a statistic, to give you a little context here, if you count hydroelectricity and then all of the other renewables that are produced in the United States, certainly a lot from wind, a lot from solar, and in certain parts of the country, significant amounts from other sources such as geothermal. Essentially, 1 out of every 5 electrons that's produced in the United States in the renewable space, about 18 to 20% of all of the kilowatt hours of renewable electricity, if you count hydro, come from the production of hydro and wind in the state of Washington. So an important legacy to us. And a lot of the policy framework that we talk about here is really ways to make sure that we are carefully stewarding that legacy well into the future and the benefits associated with that. So that's a little bit of background on the state of Washington. So the kinds of things that you see in the executive branch are these kinds of items in terms of directions from the executive branch. So in the state of Washington, the governor has the ability to issue what are called executive orders. And those apply to all of the agencies for which the governor has legal authority and where he appoints the directors of those agencies. So my agency, for example, the Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, Social and Health Services, and a number of different agencies, several dozen agencies, large agencies in the state that it covers. And these are directives to those agencies to say, well, there isn't a piece of law that says this, but I'm telling you these are the things that I want you to do under my authority as a statewide elected official. So in this instance, this is an executive order that was issued in 2014 directing a number of our agencies, Department of Commerce, Utilities and Transportation Commission, the Washington State Energy Program, and others, some of which don't quite fit under the mandate of an executive order, but directing us around actions related to climate change and energy efficiency. And in all, there are about between 14 and 18 major areas of focus as part of that, telling us, okay, here are your marching orders. Here is where I want you to move as an executive branch with respect to reducing our greenhouse gases, acquiring efficient conservation, and developing clean energy resources. And then an analogy, of course, on the other side, I used an example of the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Power Plan, which was issued under the authority of the Federal Clean Air Act, specifically Section 111D of that, where the Environmental Protection Agency said, well, Congress told us that these are our responsibilities and these are our duties under that, and we believe that that gives us the authority to move forward in terms of action in reducing greenhouse gases, specifically for existing power plants, predominantly coal-fired power plants in the United States. So what I'll do now is I'll just quickly introduce the areas that we want to talk about here and then turn it over to Susan and to Ann. So a little bit, first of all, about what are these organizations? What's a Utilities and Transportation Commission? What is the Seattle 2030 District? I'll talk a little bit about commerce, and I can fill in a little bit around what the Department of Ecology is involved at. We'll begin, if Susan is amenable to this, a little bit at the local level. So she'll talk about what's going on with respect to the Seattle 2030 District and her experiences both in that and her interactions with other local governments. And I think Susan will also touch a little bit on some of her experiences on the federal level. Then turn it over to Ann to talk about what's going on with Utilities and Transportation Commission. And then I'll be able to just say a few words related to energy and climate with respect to the Department of Ecology.
Great pleasure to be with you this morning at this conference. This is the first one I've been to, probably because I spent most of my career in the other Washington, as Tony said, working for both the EPA and the State Department on climate change. And so it's been a great switch for me to go from that federal level down to the local level. But as you'll be hearing, a lot of what we're doing at the local level obviously is affected by those levels of government above us. And so I'm going to talk about the Seattle 2030 District, which is a public-private partnership that started about 5 years ago in Seattle. And I'm also going to talk about sort of federal actions that affect us, state actions, local actions, and then kind of talk about how that impacts our members. And so our members are a wide range of real estate professionals and also local government. So we're, as I said, a public-private partnership. We have the City of Seattle and King County on our board. We have the real estate community represented by way of owners and managers and developers of property in downtown Seattle primarily. Also energy service providers and architects and engineers who are working in that area, both geographically and professionally. And we also have community stakeholders. And so other nonprofits or other groups that are interested in the same kinds of issues of promoting sustainability in downtown Seattle, and we can work together. We align our missions together so we can achieve goals together. And so the Seattle 2030 District, we have about we're up to about 116 members. We recently welcomed CenturyLink Field to our fold. We have some other buildings like the Space Needle, like the Aquarium, like the Columbia Center. So some big buildings as well as some small members that are, 20,000 square feet. So we have a wide range within downtown Seattle. So our area of focus is primarily what you see here, if you're familiar with the geography in Seattle. So looking at South Lake Union, where there's been a lot of development in the last years and will continue to be quite heavily developed with Amazon moving in and, other tech firms. We also are, as I said, down as far south as Soto, so where the stadiums are, and we're actively trying to recruit other buildings that are in those areas. So we work with these professionals, these owners, to say, hey, let's look at your energy, let's look at your water, let's look at the residents or tenants in your buildings, and let's try to reduce the use of resources and try to reduce carbon emissions in transportation. And we do that by holding educational events, kind of like this event here. We connect people together. They share their stories. We hear about needs of some of our building owners, and we connect them with service professionals. So a lot of ways we're serving as a convener, and also talk a little bit more about how we are advocates on their behalf as well. So we're trying to advance incentives and policies that will promote these kinds of actions in their buildings. And so that's something I'll be talking about. And so let's go really high level to the federal levels. I mentioned I was in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years. Finally got smart and decided I really needed to be back here where I grew up. And so made the switch last year, as I said. But, we're looking at the Clean Power Plan, and that's, what EPA put out last year. Very comprehensive, the power sector across the country. We actually got off pretty easy, and a lot of that has to do with the hydro that we already have and the plan to close what many of you know as that big coal plant in Centralia, which amounts to about half of our emissions, from the power sector already. So that was a big bonus that we got in terms of expecting that to happen. And so unlike some other states, say Indiana or Kentucky, that are very reliant on coal for their electricity, Washington State's goal is going to be far more achievable. And we'll be able to choose whether we want to go with a rate approach or what's called a mass approach. So it's whether it's a per megawatt hour rate of carbon reduction that we have to do, or a mass-based approach, which means that we could actually trade with other states. So the whole plan doesn't set up the cap and trade system, but it allows and encourages states to get together, get themselves ready to trade, and then so if a state that actually, is going to be it's going to be difficult for them to comply with the Clean Power Plan goals that they have, they could actually trade with Washington State potentially, where it's going to be maybe a little easier. So that's something that's probably going to be, kind of coming out. Now, there is this thing, as Tony mentioned, that the Supreme Court in February stayed the rule right now. And so it's not, states aren't required right now to actually be implementing it, but I think a lot of forward-looking states like Washington are still working internally and with EPA to make progress on being able to submit a plan, because you have to tell EPA, even though it could be potentially pretty easy for Washington State, you still have to tell EPA how you're going to get there. And so you have 1 year. It came out last year. The plan was to have these proposals submitted in September, but because of the stay, it's probably going to go out a little bit longer. And states were already going to be given the option to have an extension anyway. So I don't think anyone was going to see a plan out of Washington until 2018 anyway. But with the stay from the Supreme Court, it's going to be some months before the country knows whether or not this rule is going to go forward. And it's more not on the merits of the rule, but more on that there are already a lot of lawsuits. In fact, there were lawsuits before the rule even came out. So you can imagine some industries that will be adversely affected don't like this rule, and said so during an extensive comment period. But so we'll wait to see as the Supreme Court perhaps gets its ninth justice back, and they can actually operate in a more effective manner. And we'll see. But interestingly, the decision came out just days before Justice Scalia passed away, and so we'll see, obviously who the president is and who gets nominated if nothing happens, and that could very well affect the future of this rule. So, before we get to that, let me just say a quick couple words about the tax credits and the tax policy. So, although there's been a lot of gridlock in Washington, they did pass, and the president did sign something called PATH, which is Protecting Americans Against Tax Hikes. And that bill very helpfully, and law now, extended these renewable energy credits and also the energy efficiency tax deductions. And so what was going to expire is now continuing. The energy efficiency deduction only lasts through this year, at least for right now, whereas the renewable energy credits go out until about the year 2021. It's a little different for solar and wind, and then they get phased out. But that is, provides a lot of incentive for big developers to take advantage of the tax benefits. And so that really was seen as a boost into the industry, where if these were allowed to expire and weren't retroactively reimposed, then this it would have been, I think, a real kind of break on the development of clean energy, which we heard from Tony has been a real engine for jobs in the country. And then I just would want to say a quick commercial for Energy Star and Better Buildings. I was just in Washington, D.C. last week for the Better Buildings Summit. If you're not familiar with that program at the Department of Energy, it's a great way of organizing companies and cities around energy reductions. Their goals of reducing energy use by, I think it's 2.5% over 10 years, and so it's a 25% reduction. So that's exciting. They also provide a lot of technical assistance. And without Energy Star, we wouldn't have something called Portfolio Manager that many buildings use to track their energy use. And so it's critical to have these kind of voluntary programs in complement to these rules in order to get further reductions. And in a lot of ways, these are getting the reductions now, and we're still waiting for example, the Clean Power Plan to take effect, and so that there'll be those reductions envisioned to happen out to the year 2030 when the Clean Power Plan is fully implemented, and we'll see how it does, assuming the Supreme Court lets it go forward. So stay tuned. Okay, so in Washington State, I realize there could be a lot more things I could put up here in terms of all the things that are going on in the state regarding clean energy and climate change. So I just talked about the Clean Power Plan in terms of the implementation, whereas, like I said, a lot of it will have to do with just closing that one coal plant in Centralia. Other measures may be, energy efficiency. There could be, an increase even still in our renewable energy mix, which would be great, even beyond the I-937 requirements that came into play a few years ago. And so that's something that I think, we'll probably have well in hand. We'll hear more from Tony, I understand, on the clean air rule. And so we're waiting any day now, I guess. If they can't make it today, they should be doing their best to get the new rule out, because there was a draft rule that came out. There were public comments made, and then the governor and his staff decided that maybe they should take back what they put out there and try to give it a second shot and try to make it more responsive to the circumstances and to the interests that are out there, and also I think to make it more workable. And there's also that challenge because the governor is moving now. The Clean Power Plan is kind of behind, and so you have to try to figure out how you're going to integrate those two policies, where the Clean Power Plan is just about the electric utility industry, and you have the Clean Air Rule about, other big polluters. And so that's something interesting that we'll have to keep an eye on. And then you raised the carbon tax initiative, and so that's the I-732 that calls for a $25 per metric ton tax on carbon emissions from gasoline, and then that would be offset by a reduction of 1% in the state sales tax. And so the idea was that this was going to be revenue neutral. And if you've been following this, there's been some analysis done that says, well, maybe it isn't so revenue neutral. It could cost the state, and so that's something that I know I've read that the organizers are concerned about. And also there was a tax break that they didn't envision that could go to Boeing in addition to the other tax breaks you've been reading about. So that was something that could also add to the cost of implementing the carbon tax. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in the ballot in November. There are a number of groups, labor, other environmental groups, that have other ways that they'd like to see major reductions happen in carbon in the state, and not through this mechanism, but we'll see if the voters, what they want, and how that all plays out. So I think in some ways this is, again, a kind of a stay tuned moment in terms of how it's going to affect different companies, different industries, and then, as I'll get to in a moment, how it'll affect the people that we work with at the Seattle 2030 District. And then I'll just say another word about the State Energy Code, which was just updated, and there's probably a lot more expertise on the Energy Code here. Is just that, that's something that obviously, and I'll talk in a moment about, that the City of Seattle looks at as its base and then goes even further. So, the ratchet, or whatever metaphor you want to use, is just getting tighter and tighter in terms of trying to realize that, by putting these code requirements in, you're just going to get so much more efficiency baked into the shell and the equipment in the building, and kind of, take more out of potentially the hands of the occupants, whereas, as we know, it can be very challenging sometimes to get them to operate the buildings and be good stewards of the building. So as I'll talk about in the Seattle example, there's a real focus on making that core and shell very efficient and tight. And so areas like the lighting power density being reduced because of the introduction of LEDs, and also the dedicated outside air systems, the DOAS systems that are coming in, and that's something that people are looking at. And then just the last thing I'll say about at the state level is the EV sales tax exemption, which was, if you think of Washington, D.C. as gridlocked and deadlocked to some extent, and the state legislature as well, that was a one bright moment, or outcome, is the renewal and actually slight expansion of the EV tax exemption, sales tax exemption for personal vehicles. And so before it was up to $35,000, and now it's up to $42,000. So if you have that price of a car, you can get up to it's $3,100 in savings. So you can't get it on the full value of the $42,000. But so if you're going to buy a Tesla Model 3 and it really is that what they say it's going to be, then you're going to be covered for a good chunk of that. If you're going to get something more like a Nissan Leaf or a Kia Soul, you're probably going to be able to get it, the full $3,100, because that price will be, closer to $30,000 than to $42,000. But anyway, that was very positive, and that goes out to the year 2019. So it's something that, as Tony mentioned, if you're going to be looking at emissions, where are they coming from? They're coming from the cars, they're coming from the trucks. And so if you can go after those sources and switch over to the clean hydro, so much the better. So now we've started very high level, gone to the state level. Now we're getting down to me, almost. So we're in Seattle in King County, and so we're affected by sort of derivative policies and impacts. We have very strong climate action planning, both in the city and the county, in terms of setting ambitious targets that drive policy. Most recently, the mayor announced a transportation initiative called Drive Clean Seattle, which is really to promote electrification, not only with single occupancy vehicles, but trying to look at fleets, trying to look at trucking, and seeing where there may be usage, within the city to adopt these newer and emerging technologies. Also, even electric bikes. So that's something that they're looking at too, to promote more, localized transportation where they can. And then on the EVs, they're looking at how they can incentivize charging stations. And so Can they put more fast chargers in to give more infrastructure confidence to people who drive into Seattle and have to charge their car while they're at work, and then be able to drive wherever they live? I think they recognize that most people do charge at home, but having that flexibility to charge downtown, I think would give, and other places in Seattle, would give people more comfort to know that they can actually make it home, especially if they think they're going to get stuck in traffic. And it's not like you just pull over to the gas station off the exit. You've got to be a more planned focus than that. I'm not sure if you'll hear about later from other speakers, but the new ordinances in Seattle about benchmarking, that's the public disclosure. There's been benchmarking since 2011, but now it's going to be public. So that information, we understand, will be out in September. There are meetings that are going to be happening over the next few weeks that the city's organizing to get input on what that data should look like when it comes out. Some cities that have these ordinances have just put out spreadsheets. Understandably, not much was done with them. Other cities have done more with Google Maps, where you can hover over the buildings and get instantly kind of a snapshot of some key data points from those buildings. So that's something they're looking at as well. I think there's sort of a balance between the owners and managers, and perhaps they're concerned about confidential data getting out. And so I think there's some discussion around what would be most useful for the public to know about a certain building, especially if they're going to a tenant that might be looking at moving to a new building, or a service provider who will be seeing where they might have some business opportunities. And as I mentioned before, the code update at the state level is filtering down at the city level and only getting stronger, with the goal of carbon neutrality by the year 2050, and a recognition that buildings are going to be lasting until 2050 or longer. Then there's been a real push to make sure that the window to wall ratio, for example, is not so great, that there's going to be so many window space that you're going to be allowing in a lot of heat, and you're going to be, there's just the fittings around the windows just, can allow more air to come in. I mean, it's just tightening and sealing up the structures, I think, is something that's a real focus. Something we've been following, which we hope continues to be an option and actually gets promoted, is the performance-based approach. Fortunately, it's kind of new, and even developers don't really like it because they don't know at the end whether they're going to come out and meet the requirements or not, because you don't know until it's all built and if it's going to perform and get the energy use intensity number that you need. But that way, at least, you're going to be able to have a little more options. You can have some trade-offs and maybe do some more innovative things in your building if you're able to go that performance path route. And so it's something that's still in there, but we hope can get more visibility over time. And just the last thing I'll say is about the Living Building Challenge. If you're familiar with the Bullitt Center, I think that's the main sort of marquee building in Seattle that's made it through that program. It's actually set to expire in about a month. So we're working with others like the International Living Future Institute that has the Living Building program to get that extended in the City Council through City Council action. Over a year now, they've been waiting to their amendments to that program that perhaps will make it a little more accessible to developers, maybe relax the requirements slightly. Although, as we look at it, there's still a number of things that we'd like to see different that might actually make it more viable. They would like to see 20 pilot buildings happen before the year 2025. And so, I think they'll have a better chance of that if maybe some of the elements are adjusted for sort of cost issues and sort of feasibility, but we'll see how that goes. So we're waiting to see, once the program gets extended, we hope in the next few weeks, that then these amendments will come out, and we'll see how that plays out. But that'll be an interesting example for not just Seattle, but we understand cities in King County are also going to be piloting the Living Building program as well. And I don't have all those details here, but just was at a recent conference and heard about some of those activities. So it's not just a Seattle thing, it's definitely something that's happening around in various communities like Shoreline, I believe, and maybe in, I think it was Kirkland, so at least, and maybe some others too. So now we get to us. So how does this all affect these large buildings, large energy consumers with tenants and residents, and just a lot of activity, economic activity in the downtown core and in the surrounding neighborhoods? And so what a lot of these will do will actually raise our nationally lowest electricity prices, likely, just because there'll be more efforts that will have to be taken at the utility level to comply with the rules. Even with these tax credits, there's probably going to be, more investment in renewables, which can still cost, kind of dollar for dollar, sort of more than some coal, or potentially natural gas, but obviously that price is still coming down. So there will be higher prices. Now, in some ways, that's a good thing because that will incentivize more action on energy efficiency. So if building owners are going to be able to save money, they're going to the tenants will be able to save. If the tenants have the meters and they've got to make the investments, they're going to be wanting to make sure they have LEDs. They're going to want to be sure they have plug load controls in their spaces to keep their electric bills lower. And so I think that's something that's sort of this, obviously the silver lining to a lot of these requirements is that you're actually going to be have a better chance of using economic signals like a carbon tax, like regulations on electricity to lower to raise the price and hopefully increase the amount of response. But then there's business opportunities as well. So if buildings are looking at upgrading their systems maybe a few years earlier than they had planned, that would be something that could bring in service providers or other companies that work in this area, architect firms or engineering firms. And I think the other thing to recognize too is how important these incentives are. So in some ways you have the carrots that I was just talking about, and then you have the sticks, that I was just talking about, and then you have the carrots. And so how can the developer sort of get maybe a little bonus or a little more encouragement? And City Light does a great job of providing incentives, and they're looking at a number of different options. For example, pay for performance is something they've been piloting, and perhaps we'll be looking at to kind of increase this year, which is great. The Living Building Challenge, which I told you about, there's actually an incentive there where developers actually get an extra floor, so they have more rentable floor space that can pay them back for that upfront cost of making their building so sustainable. So that's kind of another way of providing some incentives. And we also understand with the tune-up program that the city might provide technical assistance to the smaller businesses, and so that way that they'll maybe be able to comply more easily without having to pay a lot of those costs themselves. So it's kind of, I don't know if it's sort of, I would say, a mixed bag. I think for what we're trying to do, it's very positive. I think because we work with the private sector, there's a lot more interest in the carrot side of things rather than the stick side. But I think they work, they've been working well together to drive the kinds of efficiencies that we want to see in the buildings to reach the goals that we have out to the year 2030. So that's why we get our name, the 2030 district. We have goals that are across the energy, water, and transportation areas to get more sustainable action from our members.
Thank you very much, Susan. I think you did a great job of going from the high level down to the local level. So with that, I'll ask Ann Rendall, Commissioner from the Utilities and Transportation Commission, to tell you a little bit about who our agency is and what kinds of exciting things they're up to, and I'll go get your slides posted up for you.
Excellent, thanks. Good morning, everyone. So how many people have heard of the UTC before I got here? Okay, this is actually pretty good. We are a small agency, but not as many people in this state know about who we are and what we do. So I'm glad to hear that you do know that. We have significant impacts on companies that drive the economy and provide important services to consumers in the state. And so just a little background, kind of teeing off on Matt Morrison's comments. There are utility commissions in all 50 states and territories of the United States, and their role is to economically regulate private utilities. So most of them focus just on energy and telecom and water. The Utilities and Transportation Commission began as the Railroad Commission in the state to regulate the monopoly railroads, and then gained other industries, including energy, telecom, water. But we also regulate a number of transportation industries. Really, we regulate the companies, so we're not the Transportation Commission. We don't do the public ferries and the tolls, and we are not the Department of Transportation that builds the roads. So we have a sort of narrow thing. What we do is we protect consumers in the state to make sure that utility and transportation services are fairly priced, available, reliable, and safe. So primarily our focus is economic regulation, setting rates, and ensuring safety for railroad crossings, pipeline, motor carriers, and we ensure for those utilities and companies that we regulate that consumers can call us if they have questions about their bills. We enforce where the companies are violating rules. So we have a pretty big umbrella of things. So about the commission, there are 3 commissioners. Dave Danner is our chair, and Commissioner Philip Jones and I are the other 2 commissioners. We each serve a 6-year term. It's staggered, so every 2 years a commissioner is up for reappointment, appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate, and the governor gets to appoint the chair. We have about 165 staff, and they're very highly technical staff. They're accountants, they're financial analysts, they are engineers, they are investigators for safety issues. We have pipeline engineers, we have railroad engineers, we have a number of attorneys and administrative law judges. We also have our folks who answer the phones when people have complaints, and believe me, I think they have the hardest job in the agency. And then we have our support and clerical staff. So the energy industries that we regulate, the companies that we regulate are the private companies. So we have 3 electric companies that we regulate: Puget Sound Energy, Avista Corporation in Eastern Washington, and Pacific Power and Light, or PacifiCorp. And they really just operate down in the Yakima Walla Walla area in the state. And then Puget Sound Energy is on the west side, and Avista is on the east side. We have 4 natural gas companies that we regulate. Again, Puget Sound Energy and Avista are combined electric and natural gas companies, and then Cascade Natural Gas and Northwest Natural. We regulate those companies both for rates and for safety. We do not regulate public utilities. That means we do not regulate Tacoma Power. Right, Pat? Right. We do not regulate. Right. We do not regulate Seattle City Light. We do not regulate Snohomish Public Utilities District, and we don't regulate the rural electric cooperatives. And those utilities, those public utilities in the state, actually serve more customers than the private utilities in the state. So the private energy utilities only serve 45% of the customers in the state. So it's a big public power state, and that's a really critical thing in this state. We also regulate other industries, and I'm just going to quickly run through this. Both the major telecommunications companies and the smaller competitive companies. So in all, it's about 400 companies. But we don't regulate cable, and we don't regulate wireless, and we don't regulate the internet. So if people call us for complaints, we can't do anything about that. We can refer them to the State Attorney General's office for complaints, or to the Federal Communications Commission. So it's very frustrating for many consumers in the state that we can't do anything for them about internet, cable, and we understand that, but our hands are tied. Private water companies. We regulate the larger private water companies, but relatively speaking, those companies range from 8 customers to thousands of customers, and not the municipal companies. So if you're served by Tacoma Water, we don't regulate those companies. Solid waste collection companies. If you have a private company that's serving a unincorporated area of the county, then we would regulate those private companies that would serve you, not the municipal. Some of the companies have contracts with cities. We don't regulate those services. We also regulate a low-level radioactive waste disposal site. That is out in Richland, and so anytime so medical waste or very low-level radioactive waste, so we regulate the rates of disposal. There's one oil pipeline in the state and a number of larger pipeline companies, and we have safety engineers that go out and make sure that things are not leaking, and we have one of the better programs in the country. And yes, we've had some issues, but for the most part, relative to other states, our program is quite good. Railroads and railroad crossings. We have jurisdiction over railroad crossings except in the major cities, Seattle, Tacoma. Some of the others are first-class cities, and we don't have jurisdiction. We regulate household goods movers. Remember that. That's a big consumer issue. Private buses and airporters, we regulate. Commercial ferries, not the private ferries, and a number of common carriers to make sure they have their insurance and all of their appropriate filings in place. So that is a lot of what we do, and but a lot of what we do focuses on energy, so I'm going to flip back to that. So just to distinguish, the commission, state agencies don't have jurisdiction over the wholesale sales. So if you have one company selling power, they have a generation facility and they're selling it to someone else, generally we don't regulate those rates. That's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. State governments have jurisdiction over retail sales and distribution and power that they produce for their own customers. So that's important later, and this is really the crux of what I wanted to talk to you about, but it was helpful to have that background of what we do. So Matt referred to utility commissions as being risk averse, and he already knows. I talked to him about this on the break. I would say actually it is that utility commissions are creatures of statute. We're limited by what the authority is that we have from the legislature. Part of that statutory authority is to make sure that the utility companies, when they come in and ask for rate changes, we can ensure that the rates are fair, both to consumers and the company, just and reasonable for consumers, but also sufficient for the companies. These are private companies, and we set their rates. So they have to have sufficient rates to be able to continue to invest. And so that's one of the balancing that we do between the consumers wanting the rates to be low and their service to be reliable, and the companies to make sure they can earn a sufficient return and have sufficient capital to continue to invest in the system. And that's really the tension, and they talk a lot about that at Lehigh, right, Matt? Right? Yep, okay. So why are utilities risk averse? They're risk averse because we can tell them that something that they invested in was not prudent, and they're not going to recover rates from customers for that investment. So it makes them very risk averse about making new and potentially in this new energy world that we're in, where things are moving so fast and changes are going so fast, we look very carefully at whether the investments they're making were prudent for consumers. And so that's where it becomes very risk averse. So this whole list of rate cases and filings, that is a lot of what we do. So right now, Avista has a general rate case before us, Pacific Power has a general rate case. Cascade just filed a settlement in their general rate case with our staff who advocate positions before us. And PSE has a case coming in January. And those cases are very technical. That's why we have the accountants and the financial analysts. They file testimony, written testimony, and books of economic spreadsheets and justifying why each and every expense that they made was something they should recover from the customers. Our staff and also other people come in, and we call them interveners, and they look carefully at those, and we have lots of back and forth about why this expense or that expense was appropriate for the ratepayers to pay for. So that's a big part of what we do. The other part is companies come in and make filings with us. They want to provide a different kind of service, and they establish a rate for that service, and they want us to approve it. One of those things is PSE has a little thing those in Tacoma may know about, is the LNG plant and the tide flats, right? So we are not the environmental siting agency. So we're not going to release permits for whether that should be done. That's part of what the city and the county will do. But the company is going to come to us and ask for rate recovery for these things and whether consumers should pay for that or whether other people should pay for that. So that I can't talk more about that case because it's pending before us, but that's the issue that will come before us. Companies have put forward pilots to pay for electric vehicle charging equipment in their service territory or rebates for their consumers, and we have to decide whether that's appropriate for the consumers. So for an example, we did approve Avista's electric vehicle charging equipment pilot. One of those issues, and they have said they're not asking for rate recovery yet, but they're going to have to come and ask us for rate recovery, and they're going to have to show that there's a benefit to the ratepayers, not just for the individual residential consumer that's getting a charging equipment at their house, but the DC fast chargers that are really a public service, and so anybody can charge up in those. So they're going to have to show that that's something that Avista's ratepayers should be able to pay for. So that's sort of the nexus of where the Commission and our economic regulation gets involved with the new energy economy, so to speak. So any new proposals that they want to come in as they're modernizing their grid, as they're putting in smart meters, any of those expenses they bring to the Commission, and we have to review them. So we also do rulemakings. We look at interconnection standards, we look at reliability standards, and we participate in some of these larger things that we've been talking about, the executive orders. The Commission had less to do in the 2014 executive order, but we were asked to look at electric vehicle, transportation electrification, look at ways we could help reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the state through our work. The governor also recently entered into what's called the Accord for a New Energy Future with 16 other states, and those governors said they were going to work towards these specific goals for diversifying energy generation and expanding clean energy sources, modernizing energy infrastructure, clean transportation options, planning for the energy transition, having energy plans and strategies, on transformational policy changes like environmentally desirable infrastructure, clean vehicles and fuels. And so our companies are going to come to us as they need to modernize their grids, and those are things that we have to decide whether customers should pay for. And I think it was Susan mentioned that rates have been pretty low in the state, and we've relied on hydropower, or maybe it was Tony who said that. It is an issue. I mean, we've been relying on this very stable, dependable infrastructure that's kept our rates low for a long time. And like anything, you have to do maintenance, and sometimes you have to replace things so you can keep having this reliable power that we have. Well, there's a few things that are going to happen that are going to cause those rates to go up, and one is replacing, and one is maintaining the grid and modernizing the grid so we can do this transactive energy. It's not free. It's going to cost money. So we've got the Clean Power Plan. Our agency is working with Commerce and with Ecology on what that response to the Clean Power Plan would be. Right now we're not doing much. We're kind of waiting to see what the Supreme Court will do, but we do continue to work on things as we can with agencies. We're participating in the Clean Air Rule in terms of responding to it and looking at how that's going to affect our utilities that we regulate and their customers. I understand, and maybe Tony, I'm going to wrap this up really quickly so Tony can talk to you about the Clean Air Rule, but I understand it will defer to the Clean Power Plan potentially for how it will impact the power companies in the state. And the last thing, and it tees off on what Matt was talking about, or someone asked a question about it. So California is a very big market, and they have something called a Regional Independent System Operator, or an ISO. Those of you who lived through the energy crisis of the early 2000s will remember, they created this and it didn't work very well, and it created a lot of markets, a lot of price spikes, and there's still litigation to this day to deal with those rates. So now PacifiCorp, who not only operates in Washington State but operates in 5 other states, including California, has decided they would like to join California's market to create a regional energy market and be able to take advantage of some of that low-cost renewable energy that California is creating too much of and has to ship somewhere. And so there's a lot of conversation going on right now around the West about whether and how to create this regional market. I've been involved, my colleague Phil Jones has been involved, and we're having very high-level conversations. One of the things that the California ISO did create was something called an energy imbalance market, and it's not a full-blown regional market where you just have to buy and sell all of your power, but each utility has to balance their own grid. If you don't balance the load, the demand, and how much you're producing, then you can have brownouts or problems. So it's a market so people can share at that edge if they have too much or they need something. And so California created this, and PacifiCorp, NV Energy in Nevada have already joined. Puget Sound Energy is working on becoming fully operational in this market in October. Portland General Electric is looking at that as well for 2017. Arizona Public Service in 2016, and now Idaho Power has looked at joining in 2018. And I think you'll find more and more both private and public utilities looking at joining this energy imbalance market. But then there's this regional market that is an even bigger thing. So even without that market, the low-cost energy from renewables is already impacting our Columbia River system hydropower operations. The money that those utilities used to make by selling their cheap hydro to California when California needed it, now California doesn't need that as much, and so it's causing an impact on our utilities. So it's not just the Northwest region, it's a Western region now, and so it's a big issue. So that's sort of the big and small of what we're dealing with, and I appreciate the time to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, Ann. I should note that Ann actually is very heavily involved in this Cal ISO issue and so forth. Actually, is going to down this weekend to work on it down in Nevada. And tying back to her earlier comment as well, if you're off enjoying your weekend, particularly on a party bus, remember that the Utilities and Transportation Commission regulates party buses. So if you have any problems, then when Ann gets back next week, you can contact her about that. Yeah, a question here or a comment.
So a lot of people, when they think about a commission like yours, if they don't know a lot of the details of what fills your days, they think of it as a policy agency, and then they get frustrated because they don't see a lot of policy making documents, real visionary position stuff coming out of commissions. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, I think we see from your workload what's really filling your days, but where do you see your authorities to make policy starting and ending?
Okay, so we are essentially reactive. We respond to what the companies file with us, and we also respond to things that happen. So an example is, unfortunately, last September, we regulate Ride the Ducks. They had a very serious accident, so we ended up having to just jump to it and respond to those issues that were coming up from that unfortunate accident and deal with that. And so we had hearings and other things. So things can happen. We can have unfortunate pipeline incidents that require us to switch our attention. So any incident like that, or then a rate case or a rate filing, we are very reactive. But at the same time, as like any other agency, we need to put together a strategic plan for our biennium. And so we're working on our strategic plan for the next 2 years. and thinking about what we can do to get ahead of some of these issues like grid modernization, and how we can think about what's important for the state and for the utilities in the state to get ahead of some of these things instead of having to be reactive all the time. So we do the best we can in trying to get ahead, but oftentimes we're interrupted by things that happen or filings that are made.
Steve?
So if the legislature or the governor has some policy agendas, can they ask or require the UTC to help to implement that and to sort of marry that with your economic regulation, your safety, and so on that you do by statute?
Absolutely. So if the legislature changes the statute and requires us to do something different, then we do that. The governor has executive orders and different things that he or other governors have asked us to work on, and to the extent that it matches with our statutory authority, there's executive authority in asking us to do, directing us to do something, and then there's statutory authority. So in that respect, it has to mesh, and so we've done the best we can to mesh what Governors Gregoire and Inslee have asked us to work on in clean energy matters with what our statutory authority is. And sometimes the legislature and the governor do not agree.
My question is about an intrastate electric vehicle charging network that gets magazine attention every once in a while and silly billboards once in a while. Is that a purview of the Utilities and Transportation Committee? And if not, why not?
So that's the Green Highway I think you're talking about, and that is actually a State Department of Transportation effort working with Department of Commerce and others. Because we don't, we regulate the specific utilities and make sure, as I said, that the rates that consumers pay are fair, just, and reasonable, and that the company can sustain its operations. So, as an example, Avista came forward and wanted to work on its electric vehicle charging station pilot, and included in part of that some DC fast charging and units that would be on the road between Spokane and Pullman, for example. So the DOT came and spoke at our one of our public meetings that we were talking about Avista's pilot, and they ended up working closely together. And so it is not within our purview because we don't manage the highways. But to the extent that there's sort of an overlap of the Venn diagram between the utility and what they're trying to do and DOT, then we would work together with them. I hope that answers your question.
And I'd add one other aspect to that too, and that is a few years ago when people were talking about putting out charging stations, there was some concern that those each individual charging station was selling retail electricity when you plug in your vehicle, and there was a concern that they would automatically be regulated as a utility by the Utilities and Transportation Commission. I don't think the Commission was terribly interested in having a lot of that, and the legislature passed a regulation that said no. It clarified that and said that those individual charging stations are not utilities for the purposes of being regulated by the Commission.
And that was actually our request bill. We requested that legislation to clarify that we're not going to get in the way of people private companies wanting to put in electric vehicle infrastructure. So, and I've really eaten into your time, Tony.
Well,
I don't think he has any left.
So I don't think I have any time. So I'm going to do the 1 or 2 minute just quick follow up on one item, because as I suspected, both Susan and Ann did an outstanding job of covering the range of activities here. But I thought it would be helpful to just again spend 1 or 2 minutes just talking a little bit about the clean air rule, which Susan talked about and provided a little information. So the Department of Ecology is doing a rulemaking analogous to the rulemaking that the Environmental Protection Agency did, using our state's Clean Air Act as opposed to the federal Clean Air Act, to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases from large emitters in the state of Washington. So these are about 2 to 3 dozen entities that produce 100,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year on an annual basis. So you can think of this as the big power plants, big industrial customers, petroleum refineries, those kinds of things. And the regulation will have a gradual ramp in of reductions from those sources, likely to be in place beginning in 2016 with the first compliance essentially by the end of the decade, up about 5% over each 3-year period. It applies to petroleum production and use. It applies to natural gas use. It applies to major industrial sources. And as Ann mentioned, it does apply to power plants, but the decision that was made under the rule is that the rule will use the Clean Power Plan as the vehicle to do that, assuming that the Clean Power Plan is upheld by the courts and goes into place. And this is designed as what's called a cap and reduce program. So it's not a cap and trade. It does not have a specific trade component in large measure because the Clean Air Act for the state does not grant that authority to the state on the executive side, and it will allow plants to, or individual emitters, to reduce on their own facility, efficiency or other measures that they might do. It will allow them to find other verified reductions in greenhouse gases from third parties. It will allow some trading with some of the other systems in the United States, for example, the California cap and trade, and be able to buy some credits from that with some restrictions around that. There's a lot more detail associated with that. You should see the new version of this. As Susan mentioned, the original version came out, received a lot of comments, was withdrawn, and it will now be resubmitted. So within the next few weeks, you should see a new version of this. And if anybody is interested, you can leave me a card and I can get you more information, or you can go to the Department of Ecology's website, and they have some very excellent material there explaining that. So with that, I appreciate your attention here. I hope this gives you a little range of some ideas of what the executive branch does at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. And I hope you take away from this that there are some pretty exciting things going on, and I think there's some interesting opportunities as well to get engaged with executive agencies in helping shape the energy policy and the energy direction of local, state, and national activities. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you to the panel.